Picture this. You're living on a world that's about to die, and there's absolutely nothing you can do about it. That's exactly what happened to the Corellians. Their sun was expanding into a red giant, and they had maybe 30 years before their entire planet would be nothing but ash and memories. But let me tell you about their world first, because it was truly something special. The Corellian homeworld was unlike anything we have here on Earth. Imagine cities that literally floated in pink and purple skies, held up by some kind of anti-gravity technology that our scientists still can't fully understand. These weren't small settlements either. We're talking about massive floating metropolises with millions of inhabitants each, connected by bridges of pure energy that sparkled like rainbows in their alien sunlight. The Corellians themselves were remarkable beings. They stood about 7 feet tall, with skin that seemed to shift colors based on their emotions, blue when they were calm, golden when they were happy, and a deep red when they were afraid. And boy, were they afraid now. Their scientists have been watching their sun for decades, measuring its expansion, calculating the timeline of their doom. The math was simple and terrifying. Their star was dying, and when it finished expanding, their beautiful floating cities would melt like ice cubes of furnace. Now, the Corellians weren't stupid. They were actually pretty advanced in many ways. They had technology that could cure diseases we're still struggling with today. Cancer? They solved that centuries ago. They had machines that could regrow entire limbs in just a few days. Their computers could process information faster than anything we have on Earth. They understood genetics so well that they could modify their own bodies to live for hundreds of years. But here's the thing. They were what you might call a peaceful species. They'd never had wars, never needed to build massive ships or develop the kind of heavy industry required for space travel. Their longest journey had been to their closest moon, which was only about 50,000 miles away. And that trip had taken them months to plan and execute. Moving an entire species across the galaxy? That was so far beyond their capabilities that it might as well have been magic. Their ships could barely make it to their own moons, let alone carry billions of people to safety across the vast emptiness of space. They had the knowledge to build amazing floating cities, but they had no idea how to build the massive cargo ships needed to evacuate their entire civilization. Think about it. We're talking about moving over 8 billion beings, along with their culture, their art, their entire way of life. Even if they worked day and night for 30 years, their tiny fleet of exploration vessels could maybe move a few thousand people at most. It was like trying to empty an ocean with a teacup, so they did the only thing they could think of. The Corellian Council of Sciences, led by their greatest minds, made a desperate decision. They would build the most powerful transmitter their civilization had ever created and send out a plea to the stars. This wasn't just some simple radio broadcast. They poured their entire planetary energy grid into this project. Every floating city dimmed its lights. Every factory shut down its non-essential operations. All of their resources went into building this massive communication array. The transmitter itself was incredible. It was built on one of their moons, a giant dish nearly a mile across, surrounded by energy amplifiers that could boost a signal strong enough to reach the far edges of the galaxy. When they fired it up for the first time, the energy discharge was so intense that it created artificial auroras in the skies of their homeworld. And then they crafted their message, not in their complex scientific language, but in simple, emotional terms that any intelligent species could understand. We are dying. Our world is ending. If anyone out there can hear this, please help us. We have children, families, dreams, just like you probably do. Please don't let us become extinct. They didn't ask for technology or weapons or trade agreements. They simply asked not to be forgotten, not to be allowed to disappear into the darkness of space like they had never existed at all. The message included their history, their culture, images of their floating cities, and their people. They wanted whoever received it to know that they were real, that they had built something beautiful, and that they deserved to continue existing. That signal began its long journey through the cold emptiness of space, traveling at the speed of light toward every corner of the galaxy. It would take years to reach the nearest civilizations, and the Corellians knew they might all be dead before any response would arrive. But they had to try. They had to believe that somewhere out there, someone would care enough to help. And here's where the story gets really interesting, because the response they got wasn't what anyone would have expected. One by one, the galaxy's most powerful civilizations received that desperate plea, and one by one they turned their backs. The first to receive the message was the Zephyrian Trade Consortium, the galaxy's biggest economic powerhouse. These weren't your typical aliens. They were basically a species of living calculators, beings whose entire culture revolved around profit margins and cost-benefit analysis. When the Corellian distress signal reached their massive corporate stations, it was immediately fed into their most advanced supercomputers. The Zephyrian analysts worked for weeks, running every possible scenario through their systems. They calculated the cost of building evacuation fleets, roughly 2 trillion credits. They estimated the resources needed for temporary housing, another trillion credits. They factored in the economic disruption of diverting their entire industrial capacity toward a rescue operation, incalculable losses. And then they asked the most important question in Zephyrian culture: what's the return on investment? The Corellians had no rare minerals. Their technology, while advanced in some areas, wasn't particularly useful for trade. Their planet would be destroyed anyway, so there was no strategic value in controlling their territory. Most importantly, they had no way to pay back such a massive debt. The computers reached their conclusion within milliseconds. Not profitable. Recommendation: file and ignore. The consortium's board of directors didn't even debate it. In their cold, business-focused minds, spending trillions to save a species that couldn't pay them back was like throwing money into a black hole. They filed the message away in their archives and went back to planning their next quarterly earnings report. The second major civilization to receive the plea was the Eldorian Empire, and their response was even colder. The Eldorians were warriors who had conquered half the galaxy through sheer military might. Their entire philosophy was built on one simple idea: strength is the only thing that matters in the universe. When Emperor Valdrak himself heard about the Corellian message, he actually laughed. Here was a species begging for help instead of fighting for their survival. In Eldorian culture, this was the ultimate sign of weakness. Their military commanders held a brief meeting and came to a unanimous decision. If the Corellians couldn't save themselves, they didn't deserve to be saved. Natural selection, they called it. The strong survive, the weak perish. That's just how the universe works, according to Eldorian thinking. They had built their empire by crushing weak civilizations, not by helping them. Why would they start now? The Emperor issued a formal decree. Any Eldorian ship that attempted to help the Corellians would be considered a traitor to the Empire. But perhaps the most shocking response came from the ancient ethereals, being so advanced that they had transcended physical form millions of years ago. These creatures existed as pure energy, floating through space in forms that looked like living stars. They had watched countless civilizations rise and fall, had seen billions of species come and go throughout the galaxy's history. When the Corellian message reached them, the ethereals barely acknowledged it. To beings who had shed their physical bodies eons ago, the concept of death was meaningless. They couldn't understand why anyone would be concerned about the destruction of mere flesh and bone. In their view, if the Corellians were truly evolved, they would have transcended physical existence long ago. The fact that they were still trapped in biological bodies proved they weren't worth saving. The pattern continued across the galaxy. The Crystalline Collective, beings made of living crystal who communicated through harmonic vibrations, decided the Corellians' problem was incompatible with their resonance frequency, essentially their way of saying they didn't want to get involved. The hive mind networks, species that had merged their consciousness into single collective intelligences, determined that helping the Corellians would disrupt their computational efficiency. Even civilizations that might seem more sympathetic turned away. The peaceful meadow worlds, a collection of agricultural planets known for their gentle nature, claimed they lacked the technology to help, which was true, but they didn't even try to find someone who could. The academic circles, species dedicated to learning and knowledge, were too busy with their research to spare any resources for a rescue operation. Species after species, civilization after civilization, all came to the same basic conclusion: not our problem. Some dressed it up in fancy language about economics or philosophy or practical limitations. But the bottom line was always the same. They just didn't care enough to help. The Corellian signal bounced around the galaxy for months, reaching hundreds of different worlds and space stations. Each time, it was received, analyzed, and ultimately dismissed. The response was always the same: silence. Cold, empty silence that echoed through the vacuum of space like a death sentence. But that signal kept traveling, kept bouncing around the galaxy's communication networks, until finally it reached a small blue world spinning quietly in an unremarkable corner of space. A world inhabited by a species that had barely figured out faster-than-light travel, whose technology was primitive compared to everyone else who'd already heard the message. That world was Earth, and humanity's response was about to shock the entire galaxy in ways no one could have predicted. When Dr. Beth Harrison first decoded that Corellian message at the Deep Space Communications Array in Colorado, she thought she was looking at some kind of elaborate hoax. The signal had been bouncing around space for 3 years before it finally reached Earth, and when her computers finished translating it, she just sat there staring at her screen in complete disbelief. Beth had been working at the facility for 12 years, and she'd seen plenty of weird signals from space. Pulsars, radio bursts from distant galaxies, even some false alarms that turned out to be microwave ovens interfering with equipment. But this was different. This was clearly intelligent, clearly desperate, and clearly real. She immediately called her supervisor, Dr. Henry Collins, who rushed down to the lab still wearing his pajamas. When Henry saw the translation, his face went white. Within minutes, they were on a secure line to NASA headquarters. Within an hour, copies of the message were sitting on the desks of every world leader on Earth. The reaction was unlike anything in human history. President Williams called an emergency meeting with Congress. Prime Minister Thompson convened Parliament at 3 a.m. The Chinese premier canceled his entire schedule for the week. Within 24 hours, emergency sessions were being held at the United Nations, and for once in human history, every single nation agreed on something. The response was immediate and unanimous. We have to help them. Now, you have to understand just how crazy this decision was. Humanity at this point was barely a footnote in galactic civilization. We had maybe a dozen small colonies scattered across nearby star systems, most of them mining operations or research stations with populations in the hundreds, not thousands. Our entire interstellar fleet consisted of about 50 ships, and most of those were cargo haulers that could barely make it to the next solar system without breaking down. Compared to civilizations like the Zephyrians or Aldorians, our technology was laughably primitive. We were still using chemical rockets for most of our space travel. Our fastest ships took months to travel distances that advanced species could cover in days. We were like a tribe with stone tools trying to compete with a modern industrial nation. But here's the thing about humans that the galaxy was about to learn. We've never been great at accepting impossible. Within weeks, something incredible happened. Every major corporation, government, and organization on Earth started contributing to what became known as the Corellian Relief Operation. And I'm talking about contributions that would make your head spin. Boeing and Airbus immediately retooled their factories to start building spacecraft instead of airplanes. Ford and Toyota converted their car assembly lines to produce ship components. Amazon redirected their entire logistics network to support the operation. Even small businesses got involved. There are stories of local machine shops working overtime to build specialized parts, farmers donating food supplies, and school children holding bake sales to raise money for the mission. The asteroid mining companies made the biggest sacrifice of all. Corporations like Deep Space Industries and Planetary Resources, worth billions of dollars, literally redirected their entire fleets away from profitable mining operations to start gathering raw materials for the rescue ships. They knew they'd lose millions in profits, but they did it anyway. Meanwhile, shipyards that normally built cargo vessels and passenger liners started constructing evacuation ships using blueprints that were being designed as they built them. Scientists like Tom Crawford at MIT and his team worked around the clock, sleeping in their labs, developing new technologies they'd need for a rescue operation of this scale. We're talking about life support systems for alien biology, faster engines than humanity had ever built, and habitat modules that could house millions of beings. The whole thing was organized chaos, but it was beautiful chaos. Humans were doing what we do best, pulling together in a crisis and refusing to give up When the galactic community heard what humanity was planning, their reaction was, well, let's just say they thought we'd completely lost our minds. Remember, these were the same civilizations that had dismissed the Corellian plea without a second thought. Now they were watching this primitive species mobilize their entire civilization for a rescue mission. The Zephyrian ambassador, a cold, calculating being named Corvash, actually requested a meeting with human diplomats just so he could understand what we were thinking. During that famous meeting at the Galactic Embassy Station, Corvash sat across from human diplomat Jack Monroe and just stared at him for several minutes. Finally, Corvash spoke in his mechanical, emotionless voice. Your species is going to bankrupt your entire civilization for people you've never even met. Your technology is centuries behind what would be required for such an operation. Your economy will collapse. Your colonies will fail. You will destroy everything you've built. And for what? A species that has nothing to offer you in return. Jack Monroe's response became legendary throughout human space and beyond. He leaned back in his chair, smiled that easy smile humans are famous for, and said, "Yeah, we are, because that's what you do when someone needs help." The silence that followed lasted almost a full minute. Corvash later told other ambassadors that he spent that time running calculations, trying to understand the logic behind humanity's decision. He never figured it out. The first human ships arrived in the Corellian system 18 months after receiving their plea, and what they found broke their hearts. The Corellian sun had already begun its deadly expansion, growing brighter and hotter with each passing day. From space, you could see the effects on their beautiful homeworld. The floating cities that had once sparkled like jewels in pink skies were now struggling to maintain altitude as their anti-gravity systems overheated. The planet's surface, once covered in crystal forests and silver lakes, was becoming a scorched wasteland. But the worst part was seeing the Corellians themselves. These proud, advanced beings were slowly dying from radiation poisoning. Their skin, which normally shifted colors with their emotions, was now stuck in dull, sickly shades. Their children, who should have been playing in those magnificent floating cities, were lying in makeshift hospitals, too weak to even stand. Captain Rose Miller, leading the first wave of human engineering ships, later described that moment in her personal log. "When I saw those kids looking up at us with hope in their eyes, I knew we'd made the right choice. I don't care if this mission kills every one of us. These people are going to live." But humanity didn't just show up with good intentions and empty promises. We came prepared to work. Captain Miller's engineering corps immediately got to work building massive orbital habitats using prefabricated sections they'd brought from Earth. Picture construction sites in space. Humans in bulky spacesuits working alongside tall, graceful Corellians, welding together the framework for entire cities that would float in the vacuum of space. Meanwhile, Dr. Paul Chen's medical team began the heartbreaking work of treating Corellians who were already suffering from severe radiation poisoning. The problem was, human medicine had never dealt with alien biology before. Corellian blood was blue. Their organs were arranged completely differently, and their immune systems worked in ways our doctors had never seen. But Chen and his team didn't give up. They worked day and night with Corellian healers, combining human medical technology with Corellian biological knowledge to develop treatments that could actually save lives. The real magic happened when human engineers started working directly with Corellian scientists. Teams led by brilliant engineers like Dan Foster worked around the clock, sharing human technology freely and learning from Corellian innovations. And what they created together was absolutely incredible. Human fusion reactors, which were powerful but crude by galactic standards, were combined with Corellian artificial gravity systems that were far more advanced than anything we'd ever built. The result was orbital habitats that could house millions of beings in Earth-like gravity while being powered by clean, efficient fusion energy. Corellian biofilters, which could clean and recycle air with amazing efficiency, were integrated into human life support systems to create environmental controls that could support both species perfectly. Together, they created ships and habitats that neither species could have built alone. The Corellians had the elegant, advanced technology, while humans brought the raw industrial power and the sheer stubborn determination to make it work on a massive scale. But it wasn't just about the big picture. It was the small, human moments that really showed who we are as a species. When young Corellian children started getting sick from stress and radiation exposure, human pediatrician Dr. Amy Walsh didn't just treat them as patients. She learned to speak their language, played their traditional games with them, and even figured out how to adapt human toys so Corellian children could play with them. She worked with Corellian healers to develop new treatments that combine human medicine with traditional Corellian healing practices. The danger was constant. The dying sun was throwing off massive solar flares that could fry the electronics on any ship caught in the open. When these deadly storms threatened the evacuation convoys, pilots like Sam Rodriguez volunteered for suicide missions to deploy protective shields. These weren't trained military pilots. Rodriguez had been a cargo hauler before the mission, but he flew his ship directly into the path of radiation storms, deploying electromagnetic shields that would protect the evacuation ships, knowing full well he might not make it back. The most incredible part was that this wasn't unusual. Hundreds of humans made similar sacrifices. Engineers worked in lethal radiation zones to repair critical systems. Doctors stayed behind on the dying planet to treat patients who were too sick to move. Ship captains pushed their vessels far beyond safe limits to evacuate just a few more families. The galaxy watched all of this in stunned silence. Species that had dismissed the Corellian plea were now monitoring every human transmission, trying to understand what they were seeing. The Zephyrian Trade Consortium sent observer ships just to watch humans work. Aldorian military commanders studied human tactics, amazed at how effectively this primitive species was organizing such a massive operation. And slowly, impossibly, it was working. Every day, more Corellians were moved to safety. Every week, new habitats came online. The death toll was dropping. Hope was returning, and an entire species was being saved by people who had every reason to mind their own business, but chose to help anyway. With just 3 months before their homeworld became completely uninhabitable, the last Corellian evacuation ship lifted off from their dying planet. Captain Lisa Thompson, who had volunteered to stay until the very end, watched from her command deck as the final transport vessel cleared the atmosphere. Below them, the world that had been home to billions of Corellians for thousands of years was already starting to crack and burn under the expanding heat of their dying sun. The evacuation itself was a miracle that still gives me chills when I think about it. Picture this. Billions of Corellians now lived in massive orbital cities that humans had built in just under 2 years. These weren't cramped refugee camps. They were actual cities floating in space, complete with parks, schools, and those beautiful crystal gardens that Corellians loved so much. Human engineers had worked with Corellian architects to create spaces that felt like home, not like temporary shelters. Meanwhile, hundreds of other Corellians were already traveling toward new worlds in joint human-Corellian colony ships. These vessels were incredible, part human industrial efficiency, part Corellian elegant design. They could travel faster and more comfortably than anything either species had built before. Families who had thought they'd die on their homeworld were now looking forward to building new lives on distant planets. But the most amazing thing about the evacuation wasn't the technology or the logistics. It was watching an entire species refuse to give up hope. Corellian children who had been dying from radiation poisoning were now playing in artificial gravity fields, their skin glowing with healthy colors again. Elderly Corellians who had accepted that they would never leave their homeworld were now teaching human engineers about their ancient technologies. The rescue changed everything in the galaxy. Other species began questioning their own attitudes towards suffering and help. The Zephyrian Trade Consortium, those cold calculating beings who had dismissed the Corellian plea as not profitable, quietly started their own aid programs. They'd never admit that humanity inspired them, of course. They just started calling it long-term investment in galactic stability. But everyone knew what had really happened. Even more shocking was what happened in the Aldorian Empire. Some of their nobles, the same warrior culture that had laughed at the idea of helping the weak, began suggesting that maybe true strength included the ability to lift others up, not just dominate them. It wasn't a popular idea at first, but slowly, quietly, it started to spread through their society. The ethereal collective, those ancient beings of pure energy, began taking more interest in physical species. They started sharing some of their vast knowledge with younger civilizations, claiming it was for research purposes. But really, they had learned something from watching humanity, that life in physical form had a value they had forgotten. For 20 years, humanity basked in the glow of our success. The Corellian refugees had integrated beautifully into human space. Many of them became human citizens, while others established their own colonies. Their advanced technology combined with human innovation led to incredible breakthroughs. We developed faster ships, better medical treatments, and more efficient energy systems. It seemed like humanity had finally earned its place among the great galactic civilizations. But then disaster struck Earth itself. A rogue asteroid, bigger than anything in our solar system's natural orbit, came screaming toward our homeworld. It had somehow been knocked loose from a distant star system and was on a collision course that would make the extinction of the dinosaurs look like a minor inconvenience. Earth had maybe 6 months before impact, and even with all our new technology, we didn't have enough ships to evacuate 4 billion people. When the news broke, humanity faced the same desperate situation the Corellians had 20 years earlier. Our scientists worked frantically to find solutions. Our engineers designed evacuation plans that could never work in time. Our diplomats sent messages to every civilization in the galaxy, hoping someone would help us the way we had helped the Corellians. But here's the incredible part. Humanity discovered something amazing about the Corellians. They had kept detailed records of every single human who had participated in their rescue, every pilot who had flown evacuation missions, every engineer who had built orbital habitats, every doctor who had treated their children, every volunteer who had donated time or money. They had documented all of it. When the Corellians heard about Earth's crisis, their response was immediate and overwhelming. Within days, every Corellian colony ship was heading toward Earth. But that was just the beginning. The response came not just from Corellian worlds, but from dozens of species across the galaxy who had learned from humanity's example. Ships arrived from civilizations that had once ignored the Corellian plea. Zephyrian cargo vessels loaded with supplies. Aldorian warships converted into evacuation transports. Even the ethereal collective materialized near Earth, offering to help in ways their kind hadn't done for millions of years. They all carried the same message. You showed up for them. Now we're showing up for you. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do when someone faces their darkest hour is simply show up. And sometimes, just sometimes, that kindness echoes across the stars and comes back to you when you need it most.